was use of an insulin pump reduces the likelihood of end-stage renal disease and hence the use of dialysis anywhere between 16 and 24%. Now, just this week, we had an announcement from the Minister of Health about some increased funds for renal dialysis as they plan additional services, probably both in hospital and in the home, which is a good thing. But we need to be looking, not the downstream equation, but rather the early interventions. And this is where the insulin pump does have its true value, because the average cost in 2009 to treat someone with end-stage renal disease is $188,000. $188,000 to look after end-stage renal disease. So we're talking here, Mr. Speaker, about an investment which will ensure we can somehow begin to address the spiraling out-of-control healthcare costs in the future. And it does take that investment now to reduce 10, 15, 20 years down the road, which will be tremendous demands. In fact, I heard someone speak just last week about, will we have enough dialysis machines? Will we have enough people to operate, to provide support services? Because we know we're moving into a cohort where type 2 diabetes is going to, in fact, be even much more pronounced than we currently have. Even the government of New Brunswick, acknowledging the fact that they're fighting a $446 million deficit budget. In New Brunswick, under the category of managing spending growth, including an investment for a comprehensive diabetes strategy, focusing on the prevention, the detection, and management of diabetes, including funding for insulin pumps. New Brunswick will be joining, it looks like, Newfoundland, Ontario, Saskatchewan, and British Columbia in funding of insulin pumps. Statistics here in Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker, speak to the need, and they speak very loudly. Over 87,000 Nova Scotians have been diagnosed with diabetes. The prevalence rate of this disease has increased in excess of 20% in the last 5 years, and that increase, Mr. Speaker, was in Nova Scotia. Type 1 diabetes rates are rising 3 to 5% every year across our country, and sadly, Mr. Speaker, the greatest rise is occurring in children ages 5 to 9. For young children, a diagnosis of type 1 diabetes requires constant monitoring and interruptions to lifestyle. And Mr. Speaker, we know that we can't go into a program right off funding all Nova Scotians that would want an insulin pump, but if we could provide children in this province with an insulin pump where it is most appropriate, that would be that small start, that incremental step that I certainly would congratulate this minister, this government, for taking even that small step forward. And I'm still hopeful that will be done. As a former educator and a vice principal in charge of junior high students, I won't forget those days when I would be looking around the school and the playground at noontime to see whether or not a child who was to come to the guidance office, that's what we use, the guidance office, to make sure that they checked in to have their sugars tested at the noon hour and take their needle during the noon break. And parents would often, call the school to actually do a check and make sure, because, that was an absolute health requirement for them. So it often results in disruptions in their learning when in school. It impacts their ability to participate in physical activities, something that is very important when dealing with their disease. Living with type 1 diabetes requires approximately 1,460 needles a year, 2,190 pokes to the finger a year to test sugars. This, Mr. Speaker, this is the burden of type 1 diabetes. If we could take our less than 1,000 children with type 1 diabetes and provide those families who are uninsured with an insulin pump, what a difference it would make in the lives of the children and in the lives of those families. So equally important then is this, financial burden. This year alone, diabetes will cost our national healthcare system $12.2 billion, representing 3.5% of public healthcare spending. Data will confirm that people with diabetes visit physicians more often, are hospitalized more often, and require more medical procedures. Pumps do away with the cost of needles. They deliver insulin at a steady rate that can cut down on kidney disease and amputation. We all know the central fact around diabetes is control. The more it is managed and create that even amount of insulin to the system, the better the outcomes. Mr. Speaker, I believe that government has an opportunity here to start with baby steps, if it so wishes. There are many private insurers that fund insulin pumps, and the public system could pay for a pump for those who do not have access to private insurance coverage. Establish a program of last resort. If we simply had even that small step forward, what an advance for this province. And I think if we look at that small step, rather the entire cost of providing thousands of these pumps to the broad spectrum of those with diabetes, this would be a good initial start. Oftentimes, Mr. Speaker, those families without insurance coverage are those most directly impacted with type 1 diabetes. We know that insulin pump does not work for everyone. Absolutely willing to say that. And that, work with the Diabetic Care Program to establish the parameters under which funding would be made available. They can also follow the example of other jurisdictions, start a program that provides coverage for only those under 18. And I know, Mr. Speaker, one family in my riding with 2 daughters with type 1 diabetes. They're now junior high and high school, and one is on the insulin pump, and one started out using, stayed on the needle, and they wanted the family to actually take a look at, what the results would be. And very clearly, after 6 months, the insulin pump was indeed the best mechanism for dealing with their diabetes. And I think we have to look clearly at these examples. So my message to the government is simple. Pump has the potential to offer both a short-term and a long-term cost benefit to the province. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Thank you. Now recognize the honourable member for Antigonish.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I want to start off by suggesting or telling the member opposite that I listened carefully to his comments, and I'm moved by a lot of what he had to say, and I don't disagree with a lot of what he had to say. I think this is a very important issue for all of us to be looking at. I want to basically tell this House about my personal involvement with diabetes, in that my family involvement, I think, allows me to speak with some conviction about this issue. My mother died just 2 years ago now, and she was 94 at the time of her death, and she had diabetes for the last 30 years and was on needles daily, four needles a day. She ended up with one kidney, and the last 6 months of her life were really spent on kidney dialysis, which was a very painful thing for her to endure and for us to watch. Her own mother as well died with diabetes at a considerably younger age. On my father's side, his brother, an older brother of his, Jimmy Smith, was the youngest person, I believe the family tell me this, in Nova Scotia to be on insulin at that particular time. And he died in the early 60s, in his early 50s. On my mother's side, besides her mother having diabetes and herself, she lost 4 siblings to diabetes. Her brother Joe, her sister Blanche, her sister Jenny, and sister Mary Irene Peck, who was a sister of the Congregation of St. Martha's. They all died of of diabetes complications. My Uncle Joe, who I said died as well with this illness, his son, also called Joe, was inflicted with diabetes, and he went through a very painful last number of years of his life. One leg was amputated, then another leg was amputated. He ended up in a nursing home. He went blind. So I feel that I know a lot about diabetes, and I know how it affects and impacts families. And this is a matter that is, as I said, of importance to me. Now, last evening, I had the opportunity to attend with many of my colleagues the dinner hosted by the Diabetic Society or Association of Nova Scotia, and I was particularly moved by the very eloquent and poignant speeches that were given by some of the people who were affected by diabetes. In particular, there was a young girl, Danielle was her name, who told us about her life and how having an insulin pump had made significant changes for her. And her father followed up after her and talked about how the insulin pump had made a significant improvement in the overall family's life. But the father also went on to talk about insulin pumps in terms of their cost. And he indicated, I believe he told us, that the cost of the insulin pump for his little girl was more than the cost of the car in his driveway. Some of the research I've done on this indicates that an insulin pump costs about $7,000, but they have to be replaced every 5 years. So it's not just a one-off, you pay $7,000. They don't last a long, long time. So it is an expensive undertaking for a family to have to meet. We in government have looked at this issue. We continue to look at this issue. We know that it's an important consideration for people, and we are monitoring and assessing whether or not insulin pumps are something that can get in the mix. Ideally, we would all love to be able to say, whatever's best for people, let's have. But we know that we can't do that in our economy and facing the financial burden that this government has, the province has. We cannot just say yes to everything that people ask for. Now, insulin pumps are something that, as I said, in an ideal world, those that need them should have them. Not all of provinces in the country are supporting this. Some of them are, and some of them are perhaps by making choices and options that they've made. For us, when we came to government, a lot of the choices and options that we could make have been taken away from us. And they've been taken away from us because we were left with a huge deficit. Now that deficit still exists, and there is still, every year, it's coming down, but we are actually spending more money than we're taking in. And the reason we're spending more money is that commitments were made before we came to government. And I'm not suggesting that some of these commitments weren't valid or that they weren't legitimate. But the difficulty was that they committed to spending money that we no longer have. The offshore monies have dried up, and that's those sorts of funds that might have funded all of those things that were promised and implemented no longer exist. So we're faced every year with trying to pay for things that have been promised and that have been put in place with money that we don't have. So can we take on yet another expense? I looked at the report that was issued yesterday by the Diabetic Association in Nova Scotia, and they tell us that over the next 21 years, if we provided insulin pumps for all of those people with type 1 diabetes, that at the end of that 21 years, we would be saving 1.2 to 1.4 million in other healthcare costs. Between now and then, for instance, in 2012, it would cost us $0.8 million more in providing pumps than we would get back from servicing, or from other services that wouldn't be needed because of the pumps being used. So effectively, initially, it's going to cost us $800,000 if next year we introduced insulin pumps. And simply put, we cannot afford to do it. That doesn't mean that we aren't doing what we can for people with diabetes, and the commitment that the ministers gave and ministers given on this is that we will look at this issue. We are going to be getting information from the other provinces that have this program, and we're going to assess both its economic viability and the benefits that, from a health point of view, can come from buying or getting into provision of insulin pumps. So basically, at this stage, what we're saying is that we cannot afford to make this kind of investment. But what else are we doing? That's the important thing, to assist people with diabetes. Every year, we're putting in $19 million towards helping people with diabetes, to help buy their insulin, to help buy their the strips they need for testing, and other supplies that they need. In addition to that, there are 39 clinics, diabetic clinics across the province where people with diabetes can go to get help. My mother was one of those users. She loved going to the clinic. It was a place where she could go to get information, if she had a problem, to get advice, where she could meet other people with a similar situation with diabetes. Actually, it was a social outing for her. They'd go and they'd do their testing, and then they'd have a lunch afterwards. It was kind of like a club. And these kinds of things are the kinds of supports we can put in place. But $19 million every year is going towards diabetes support. So I just wanted to say that overall, our approach to this is a measured one. It fits in with our Better Health Sooner plan of looking at healthcare costs, seeing where they can be best allocated, and realigning where that money goes. So that's what we're doing. That's what the minister has indicated is the best approach to take, and that's the approach we will take as we go forward with this. So thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Chair now recognizes the Honourable Member for Victoria the Lakes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'm pleased to rise in my place this evening to discuss this very important resolution that has been put forward by the Honourable Member from Halifax Clayton Park. Mr. Speaker, diabetes is a chronic, often debilitating and sometimes fatal disease. Diabetics either cannot produce insulin or cannot properly use the insulin their body produces. And as a result, blood glucose levels are heightened, which, if not remedied, can damage organs, blood vessels, and nerves. Mr. Speaker, here in Canada, more than 9 million Canadians are living with diabetes or pre-diabetes. And Canada has the highest out-of-pocket costs for diabetes than our peer countries. And Mr. Speaker, when we look at some of the statistics that are out there, just for Nova Scotia alone, it's very troubling. In 2010, the estimated diabetes prevalence was 9.9%, or approximately 87,000 people. And it's estimated that in 2020, the prevalence will be 12.2%, approximately 125,000 people, which is an increase in those 10 years of 44%. And even going beyond that, it's estimated that in 2032, the estimated population of those with diabetes will be 157,000. So, Mr. Speaker, when you look at these numbers and include the out-of-pocket expenses incurred by Nova Scotians with diabetes, the numbers are very troubling. Just the out-of-pocket costs for Nova Scotians alone. Those with type 1 diabetes, their out-of-pocket costs are approximately $559.76 a year, 3.9% of their individual income. And those with type 2, $2,868.39, 9.6% of their income. And of course, Mr. Speaker, we also know that people using insulin pumps pay 2 to 6 times more than those who don't. Mr. Speaker, lower-income Canadians with diabetes bear the highest out-of-pocket costs compared to those with the higher incomes. And we know that the highest diabetes rates here in Nova Scotia are in the Cape Breton and South Shore District Health Authorities. Over 6,100 new cases of diabetes are diagnosed each year, averaging about 500 new cases a month. Crude prevalence of diabetes has increased by 25% in the past 5 years. And Nova Scotians have a 5% chance of developing diabetes. And on a sad note, Mr. Speaker, in 2008, 2009, 2,461 Nova Scotians died as a result of diabetes complications. I'll continue, Mr. Speaker, with some of the facts concerning people living with diabetes. Those people are 2 times more likely to die each year. They're 3 times more likely to have cardiovascular disease. Mr. Speaker, people between the ages of 20 to 39 are 11 times more likely to have cardiovascular disease. People living with diabetes are 2 times more likely to have hypertension. And again, in the age group 20 to 49, that increases to 6 times as likely. People living with diabetes are 6 times more likely to have kidney disease. The ages 24 to 29 are 27 times as likely. And again, people with diabetes are 2 times more likely to be hospitalized. And hospital stays are normally 4 days longer. These are all very scary, but real facts, Mr. Speaker. When you look at the treatment of diabetes, Mr. Speaker, most Nova Scotians with diabetes are expected to endure the costs for some of the following items: diabetes management supplies, syringes, lancets, glucose testing meters, test strips, and insulin pumps, insulin and/or other diabetes-related medications, medication to lower blood pressure and other medications for diabetes-related complications, and in the event that debilitating complications arrive, specialized home care visits. Mr. Speaker, 57% of Canadians with diabetes say they don't comply with their prescribed therapy because they can't afford their medications, the devices, the supplies, thus potentially compromising their diabetes management. And of course, we all know that this increases the risk of such complications as heart attacks, strokes, blindness, kidney failure, and depression. People with diabetes have less access to public or private insurance because of job loss, etc., and that means greater out-of-pocket expenses, which for the average individual is already a great deal. The high costs for treatment are already a challenge for low-income Canadians. Mr. Speaker, lack of access to these diabetes supports can increase the cost, or the risk, I'm sorry, of costly life-threatening diabetes complications. And we know that the Canadian Diabetes Association recommends that all governments address the out-of-pocket expenses for people living with diabetes by both enhancing financial assistance for those individuals and ensuring access and affordability of diabetes medications, devices, and supplies. Mr. Speaker, the evidence of the medical benefits of the insulin pump versus multiple daily injection shows that the technology can lead to better health outcomes for people with diabetes. In addition, there is evidence showing government investment into these programs would be cost-effective. Insulin pumps, more so than multiple daily injections, will reduce the number of serious complications experienced by people living with type 1 diabetes. The cost effectiveness primarily comes from fewer incidents of diabetes-related complications. These complications are true drivers of increasing costs. And if nothing is done, the financial costs arising from these complications will match and then exceed the financial costs of implementing an insulin pump program. If a program were to be implemented, the savings would grow each year. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to provide a financial background of the insulin pump program. In the first year of implementation, the net cost to Nova Scotia would be $650,000. And the net financial savings is expected to grow each year, reaching approximately $1.4 million by 2023. And I think it's very important, Mr. Speaker, to note that this is contrary to what the Minister says. She seems to believe there'll be no cost savings until 2023, and that's not true. It will continually grow in coming years and ultimately reach $1.4 million in 2023. Mr. Speaker, it's been proven that the availability of insulin pumps reduces the incidence of myocardial infarction by 10%, end-stage renal disease by 24.4%, and lower limb amputation by 7%. But the incidence of stroke increases. But this is not because of the diabetes, it's because people go on to live longer and are more likely to suffer old age-related strokes than diabetes. The economic impact of insulin pumps. The overall cost of providing insulin pumps for people with type 1 diabetes is $3.8 million. In 20 years, it'll rise to $5.6 million. Mr. Speaker, the honourable member from Antigonish says government cannot afford insulin pumps. But my question to government is, can we not afford to do it? So, Mr. Speaker, the benefits of funding insulin pumps are many. And it's time for this government to do what's right for those suffering from diabetes and their families. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, and I want to thank all members for their input in tonight's debate. The House will now rise and meet again tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock till 12 o'clock. We are now adjourned.